Chapter 7, Section 2, Part B. At a young age, nobles began training to become knights, and this is what they would look like. When training was done, sometimes it began as early as age 7, the young man was made a knight in a public ceremony. It was a big deal. Knights wore armor and fought with swords, axes, lances, usually on horseback. They also engaged in mock battles called tournaments. One thing we need to remember, knights were trained to go to war. They were trained to be part of an army and to fight. When there was no war, knights became bored, and although knights were supposed to be nice and chivalrous, as we will see later on, an awful lot of times they were not. So to stop them from being bored, the kings or the higher lords would put on something called a tournament. In a tournament, knights on horseback would ride toe at each other with lances, and they'd try to knock each other off the horse. It was a way to just keep them occupied. In the later Middle Ages, knights adopted a code of ideal conduct called chivalry, ideal conduct. Not all the knights were chivalrous. It required them to be brave, loyal, and true to their word, as well as to fight fairly and protect the weak. So the weak meaning women, children, peasants as a whole. Once again, knights weren't always this nice. In theory, chivalry put women on a pedestal, troubadours. So men who roamed the country and put on shows and sang songs which were really stories. They sang about brave knights and their devotion to their loves. I'm sure it was all very nice, but a lot of these knights weren't very nice at all. The manor was the heart of feudal life. We are still talking feudalism. Feudalism is a political and social thing. The manor, we're talking manorialism, and the economic system of feudalism. The manor was the heart of feudal life. It included a village or two in surrounding lands. The manor system worked by mutual obligation, feudal obligation. Most of the population were serfs, so serfs were peasants. They are bound to the land, that is true. They, however, are not slaves. They could never move off the land, however, but let's look at the chart, which gives us the mutual obligation. The lord of the manor would give land for farming to the peasants. Now, the peasants didn't own this land, but they were given land to work. They were given protection in case of wartime, and they couldn't be forced off the land. They would always have a place to live. This was very important to the peasants. They're not going to be able to go too far anyway. It's not like there are cars. No one owns a horse except the higher-ups, the lords and the knights. So the peasants couldn't go far anyway. So it was good to know that they had protection, they had a land to farm, and they couldn't be forced off that land. In exchange, the peasants paid rent. Now, this slide says that money or crops. I sincerely doubt peasants had any money at all. Money at this time would have been coins, and I seriously doubt they had any. So they would trade in crops. They labored on the Lord's lands. When there was nothing to do in the fields, then they could mend fences and fix bridges and things like that. And they had to pay certain fees on the manor itself. Now we're going to look at a picture of a manor, and I'll explain the fees at that time. Here we go. So this is the big house. Now it's either a castle, depending how big the lord was, how powerful he was, or it's a manor house, but it's still fairly big. We have a blacksmith, we have a watermill. This is where They would possibly grind wheat into flour, and to do that, the serf would have to pay a fee to use this mill. The serf would also have to pay a fee to use the village oven. The serfs' houses were basically huts. They lived in huts with the animals, probably just one room shack. Here are the fields and the all-important church. Now, in Western Europe, this would be a Roman Catholic church. And we're going to talk more about medieval church in the next section of this chapter. Also, please notice that there is a river running through this manor that's ideal for the people living here. They can get water to drink, they can get water for the animals, they can wash here. Once again, living on a river is ideal for the people in medieval times. Manors were self-sufficient, producing everything the people needed. Most serfs had never traveled farther than a few miles away during their entire lives. Once again, they couldn't. The only mode of transportation that was going to get them anywhere was a horse, and they simply couldn't afford one. Manors included fields, mill, church, peasants' homes, and the lord's manor house. If it was a high lord or a king, it would be a castle. Life was harsh and short for peasants. That probably doesn't need to be said. Everyone worked long hours. Few lived past the age of 35. That was probably old for them at that time in medieval times. They ate a simple diet of bread and vegetables, slept in their huts with their livestock. Once again, it's a one-room home. Peasants had a week off at Christmas and Easter, which really tells us something. It tells us that the medieval church was very, very powerful. They could tell kings and lords what to do, and they did. And we will learn more about that in the next section.